In the last session, we kicked off the strategy formulation process by looking at business level strategy, which is the most basic type of strategy. Specifically, we looked at Porter's generic strategies, which include cost leadership, differentiation strategies, and segmentation strategies. Now, in today's session, we are going to dive a little bit deeper into business level strategies by looking at competitive rivalry and competitive dynamics. We're going to look at what drives competitive attacks and responses and how we can possibly predict those attacks and responses of our competitors. To illustrate what I mean by competitive rivalry, here are a few examples of big, famous competitive rivals. For example, Coca-Cola and Pepsi, Adidas and Nike, McDonald's and Burger King, and here in Thailand specifically, Pizza Company and Pizza Hut, or Lotus and Big C in the hypermarket segment. So these are companies that fight very hard for space and for market share in their respective industries. Now, let's kick off with some basic definitions as usual. Competitors are firms that are operating in the same market, offering similar products and targeting similar customers. So for two companies to be identified as competitors, they would have to meet basically these three requirements. What is competitive rivalry? It is the fight of those competitors for market share, for an advantageous position in the market, and it consists of competitive actions and the respective responses. And then finally, competitive dynamics are all those actions and responses put together of all the firms in the market. Now, why do we need to study competitive rivalry? In the end, we want to understand our competitor. We want to understand the competitor's way of thinking, and eventually we want to predict the competitor's behavior. We want to see whether the competitor is going to attack us or how the competitor is going to react and respond if we are attacking the competitor. Now, before jumping into the analysis of the competitor, we first need to take a step back and need to be very clear of what is actually a market and what is the competitive environment that we are playing in. And a good way to start is to look at economics. And economics identifies competitors by looking at products that can substitute our product. And the way to measure this is cross-price elasticity. What does it mean? It means how does the quantity that we can sell change if the competitor changes its price. So basically what happens here is if this equation is positive, then the two products are substitute products, are competitive products. Meaning, for example, if the competitor increases their price, the quantity for our product will go up. So both sides of the equation are positive, and therefore the entire equation will be positive as well. Our products are substitute products or competitive products. It can also happen that we have a complementary product that is closely linked to ours, and then this equation would be negative. But the larger eta, the elasticity is, the more competitive are the two products. Now these are two products. Now how can we define the whole market? Economics also has an answer to this one, and that is collective price elasticity. Collective price elasticity is a bit of a thought experiment. It is identified as the change of the quantity when the change of all firms in the market happens for the price of their products. So basically, we are saying that if this equation is small, meaning we change the price of all firms in the market and the quantity remains basically unchanged. That means that the customer doesn't have a choice. There's no substitute products, and therefore we have actually covered in our analysis the entire market. So all the companies that we have considered actually make up the market. Now, if we miss the company, then this change in quantity will be large. So if all the companies that we have in our analysis change the price, and then the quantity drops because of the price increase, that means that customers go to another company. So there must be another element, another company in the market that we have forgotten our analysis. But if this is small, then we have covered the full market. Now you can see already from me talking about this that this is very theoretical, and it is very difficult in practice to observe, to study this, and to actually make it meaningful for our strategic analysis. So we need a simpler way. And luckily, business studies has a way to do that in a very qualitative matter. And this is based on two factors. The first factor that we look at is market commonality. So the question here is, how many markets are two competitors jointly involved in? And what is the degree of importance that each of the companies is assigning to this individual market? That's the market commonality. And the second aspect is resource similarity. So how similar are the resources, tangible and intangible resources, in terms of type, amount, and quality? And this is illustrated in a 2x2 matrix, as you can see here. On the x-axis, we have resource similarity, and on the y-axis, market commonality. And let's talk through the four different fields that we have here. Our two companies are depicted as blue and red for company X and company Y. And resources that are similar, resources A, are shown as rectangular shapes, and the triangle would be a different type of resources, B. So let me talk through an example. Here, in this field, we would have high resource similarity and high market commonality. So going back to the example that we looked at earlier, Lotus versus Big C, both of them are hypermarket players. Both of these players have very similar resources. The building looks very similar. Both have shopping malls attached to their hypermarket. The POS systems, the number of people, the number of resources that are used, the shelving, the lighting, everything is very, very similar between the two companies. And the market, the target market in the lower to mid customer segment is also very similar. So there's a very high overlap, and therefore they are fierce competitors in the market. Now here is an example where the resource similarity is still high, but the market commonality is not that high anymore. Market commonality is low. An example for this one would be Lotus and Makro. So Lotus, again, is a hypermarket player here in Thailand. Siam Makro is a cash and carry format that targets mostly B2B customers. Now, the resources that they use are quite similar. The number of people that they hire, the qualifications that they hire, the POS system, the layout of the store, all of these are fairly similar. However, the market is not. Lotus is targeting individuals, is targeting end consumers, is targeting families. Makro, on the other side, is targeting business customers, so restaurants, hotels, catering companies. Now, they have some overlap in terms of large families. So the large families might actually buy from either of the companies, but that overlap is quite limited. The next example is a situation where we have low resource similarity, but very high market commonality. An example for this one could be Lotus, again, and Gourmet Market, which is a premium supermarket here in Thailand. Now, in terms of resources, Gourmet Market has much more services attached. It is more premium. It has different types of products. The shelving, the store layout, everything looks quite different from what Lotus has. But the target market is fairly similar. So there's a big overlap, especially in the middle and upper middle class segment. And therefore, a high market commonality, but low resource similarity. And finally, this is an example where we have both low market commonality and low resource similarity. The example that comes to mind here is maybe Lotus, again, and Fuji Super, which is a Japanese supermarket that targets specifically Japanese customers. So it has Japanese speaking staff. The products are imported from Japan is quite higher end, and it's very much targeting the niche of Japanese customers or Thai customers that would like to shop very specific Japanese products. So therefore, the resource similarity is not very high, and the market commonality is also not high. So this is a way of looking at the market and understanding who actually are our main competitors and who are secondary competitors. Now, the next step is to understand what are actually drivers of competitive actions and competitive responses. So what drives the competitive rivalry? And there are three drivers. The first and most basic driver is awareness. So let's talk through an example here. For example, we have Lotus and Big C, and let's assume that Lotus is lowering their prices for a specific period on grocery products, which is also Big C's main selling category. So the first step is, if Lotus lowers their prices, in order for Big C to take any action on this, they need to be aware what is actually happening in the market. So that's the prerequisite of any competitive action. Now, if Big C misses that, is not aware of what is happening, it might lead to a severe negative impact for the company. So awareness is the first key driver for competitive actions. Once we have awareness and once we know what is going on in the market and with our competitor, then there's still a question of whether we are actually motivated to react. So in our case, where Lotus has lowered the prices in the grocery category, because it is such an important category for Big C as well, it is very likely that Big C has enough incentive to take action and response. Because the market commonality in this area is very high. Also, it's a core category for both Lotus and Big C in the grocery segment, and therefore it's quite likely that Big C will take actions. Now, if this attack would come in an area that is not important, or maybe where Big C has very little sales, they might not react and might not have a motivation to take any action in response. Finally, a company can only take strategic action if it has the ability to do so. So in the hypermarket example, it could be simply that Big C has run out of stock for a certain category, and therefore it doesn't even have the ability to respond. So the market share will automatically go to Lotus anyway. There's no competitive response that Big C could offer if it is running out of stock. However, if Big C has sufficient stock, then for sure there is a motivation to respond, and the ability is there as well. It has enough resources and the flexibility to react, and therefore it will very likely take a competitive response here. Important to mention that the greater the imbalance of the resources, the smaller is also the likelihood of a response. Next, I would like to look a little bit deeper into what actually drives this likelihood of an attack or a response. So starting off with the basic definitions first. So attack or competitive action is there to build or defend competitive advantage and improve the company's market position. And then the response in return is to counter the effects of the original action or of the attack taken by a competitor. And there are three factors that influence the likelihood of an attack. The first one is timing. There is something called the first mover incentive. That is the expectation of a company to have higher returns, to have more customer loyalty, and gain a bigger market share and a reputation as an innovator if they move first. A classic example for this one would be Apple, who has the reputation of being the innovator and moving first, bringing in new gadgets, new functionality into the market, basically all the time. There's also second mover incentive. So companies might decide not to be the first mover and to wait first, especially if there's high uncertainty about a technology. They might first want to study the customers, save on R&D as R&D becomes cheaper as time passes by. They might also trying to take the opportunity to improve the process, avoid the mistakes, see the mistakes that competitors make, and then avoiding those mistakes and making it better. There's also something called the late mover incentive, and that is if you miss the boat, then it's better to move late than never. So timing is a big factor in the likelihood of an attack, depending on what you believe in, whether you want to be the first mover or you want to be the second mover. That influences the likelihood of an attack. Second is organization size, and that can go either way. So there are advantages for small companies. Small companies are usually more flexible. They have a big range of actions that they can take. And if anything goes wrong, the impact usually is rather small in case of a failure. Now, for large companies, they have much more resources and can therefore maybe act easier. And any negative impact that comes from the action that they take, it is easier to be absorbed because of the sheer size of the company. So it can play out either way. The third factor is quality. The quality is defined as meeting or exceeding customer expectations, and it can come as product quality dimensions like performance, features, durability, serviceability, aesthetics, and so on, or service quality dimensions like timeliness, courtesy, consistency, convenience, completeness, and accuracy of the service provided. The key here is that we need to understand what is our position and what is the competitor's position in terms of quality, because a company that has quality issues is less likely to launch a competitive attack and is also more vulnerable and might not be able to respond. So timing, company size, and quality are the three factors that influence the likelihood of a strategic attack. Now, briefly talking about response, there are also three factors that influence the likelihood of a response. The first one is the type of action and the expectation of the potential impact. And a famous example here is Coca-Cola, that saw Pepsi in the 1920s changing their pricing to 5 cents, basically a nickel for the 12-ounce bottle, and didn't react because they didn't expect Pepsi to gain such a big advantage and gain back market share through this action. So they didn't take any action because the expectation was different. The second is the actor's reputation. So if the actor has a very strong reputation and is likely to have a big impact on us, then we are more likely to respond to the attacker. And finally, the dependence on the market. So if the attack happens in a market that is very important to us, where we have a big market share, which is core to our business, then we are more likely to respond. If it happens in a market that is not important to us, or where we have only a very small stake, we might actually let it go and not respond. Next, I would like to look briefly at competitive dynamics. And a great way to study competitive dynamics is McKinsey's SCP, or Structure, Conduct, Performance model. How does this model work? The idea behind this is that changes in the structure in a market, for example, consolidation, leads to a change in conduct of the players in the market, and then consequently to a change in performance as well. And we can study this chain of changing in structure to the conduct and to the performance. However, the model is a dynamic model. It also works the other way around. So sometimes changes in performance, maybe because the profitability is dropping, maybe customer trends are changing, are forcing a change in conduct of the companies. And as companies maybe consolidate or price less aggressively, the structure might as well change. So this model works forward and backward. It's a very dynamic model. Important here to mention is that these changes in structures are often triggered by external shocks. For example, a change in government policy, a change in regulation, or maybe a natural disaster or anything else happening in the outside environment that forces an industry to have some structural changes. And just to show how this model works and how this looks like in action, this is an example of the Australian beer industry as an example from McKinsey, who studied the Australian beer industry in 1985 to 2001. And basically looks at all the external shocks that happened during that time and how structure, conduct, and performance changed accordingly. And you see there's a lot of dynamics built in here, a lot of back and forth. And the principle of this model is to try to actually look forward. Now, this is a backward-looking analysis, but the idea is to try to look forward and study what happens now if I acquire a competitor, if I start to consolidate the industry. What are my remaining competitors are going to do in terms of conduct, and how is the performance of the entire industry, our performance and the competitor performance, changing? And then how will that in turn, again, affect the conduct and then the structure of the industry? So we try to model a complete cycle forward-looking for an industry. That's competitive dynamics. One last point to mention here is that markets don't move at the same speed. There are different types of markets. The basic one is a standard cycle market. Typically, it takes about 5 to 7 years for a cycle to be completed. There are some competitive advantages, and companies are shielded for a limited amount of time, for some time. Imitation is possible, but it will take some effort. And an example here for me is the automotive industry, where cycles like new models are being launched in about a 5-year cycle. Much faster are technology markets, for example. So here the cycle time is 3 to 4 years, or maybe even faster, 1 or 2 years. Here the competitive advantages are not shielded. Imitation is happening very fast and very inexpensive, and companies continuously have to innovate and come up with new products and new ideas to remain their competitive edge. But there are also slow cycle markets, and here for me the steel industry comes to mind. They're typically industries where we have very heavy capital investment, they're very capital intensive, and therefore shielded from new entrants or from competition to come into the market. Imitation is costly. It takes time to build a new factory, a new plant. And therefore the cycles for these markets are typically 8 to 10 years. So markets are moving at different speed. So this was a brief introduction into competitive rivalry and competitive dynamics. We looked at some frameworks and some ways to study competitive dynamics and to forecast and predict what the competitors are doing. So this concludes our session on business level strategies and competitor behavior.